Walking with Jesus 3, the raising of Lazarus. Today we're faced with a story that is both puzzling and triumphant. Jesus proves to the crowds once and for all that he is Lord of all, but his friends suffer days of apparently unnecessary grief and ultimately find themselves imperilled by the Jewish authorities. Today we're going to look at the Apostle John's account of the raising of Lazarus. It's probably 12 months since the events of our first two episodes. For many months now, the Jewish authorities have been actively seeking to denounce or kill Jesus. He's been healing people on the Sabbath, and even encouraged his disciples to pick grain on the Sabbath in direct opposition to the authorities, the guardians of the law. The last straw was when he referred to God as his Father, effectively making himself equal with God and putting himself above the Jewish authorities. They would not allow this to continue. Reading from John chapter 11. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus was now sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. I've always been intrigued with how this passage begins. Whenever I read it, I'm struck by its awkwardness. It seems that John is having trouble explaining things. As we start to read it, it appears that this story is about someone of no special significance, a man named Lazarus. But as the story unfolds, we find that Lazarus is actually a loved friend of Jesus and brother to those other special people, Mary and Martha. It's almost as if John is deliberately trying to jar our minds for what is to follow. This little family lived in Bethany, a village about 3 kilometres from Jerusalem. From the end of chapter 10, then Jesus went back across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing in the early days. And referencing chapter 1 verse 28, this all happened at Bethany on the other side of the Jordan, where John was baptizing. It appears that Jesus was in another place called Bethany. It's thought that this other Bethany was about 30 kilometres away, past Jericho and across the Jordan. To avoid confusion, from now on when I mention Bethany, I mean the village near Jerusalem. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. One of the things to be aware of when reading Scripture is that elapsed time is not always well represented. From verses 3 and 4, we could easily conceive in our minds that the sisters sent word and it reached Jesus within a few minutes or a couple of hours. In fact, if the sisters knew where Jesus was and sent a messenger directly to him, unless the messenger went on horseback, it was at least several hours' travel to deliver the message. That's if they knew where he was. And if the messenger had to search, it could have taken multiple days. We don't even know if there was a specific messenger, although the commentators assume there was, and that he returned to the sisters with Jesus' response on his lips, that urgency was not necessary, for the situation was not as serious as it appeared. Well, if a messenger did return to Bethany before Jesus with the good news that this sickness will not end in death, he would have found Lazarus already dead and buried. Imagine the sorrow and confusion of the sisters and their comforters on hearing Jesus' response. How could he, the Lord, get it wrong, Surely doubt about Jesus would have crowded the minds of at least some of them. Yet it's not recorded that anybody mentioned it when Jesus eventually arrived. So perhaps there was no returning messenger. There are 3 passages where we read about Mary and Martha. Luke chapter 10 verses 38 to 42, where Martha is too busy with preparations to join her sister listening to the Master. This passage, and John 12, where Jesus had a meal with them on his way to Jerusalem. Their parents are not mentioned in any passage. In fact, in the Luke account, we are told that Martha opened her home to Jesus. So it looks like it was just the 3 of them, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. If that was the case, what might have been the situation for Martha and Mary now that their brother is dead? As we discussed a couple of weeks ago, according to God's instruction recorded in Numbers 27, 8 to 11, an uncle or another near relative of their father could claim rights over the family inheritance, in particular their home. But would this person take responsibility for 2 unmarried women? So the sisters not only had the grief of the loss of their loved brother, they may also have had uncertainty and concern about their own future. Undoubtedly, the most perplexing statement in this passage comes in verse 6. He stayed where he was 2 more days. Even though Jesus did understand the situation better than anyone, even though he loved this family, and even though he knew they wanted him to go to them as soon as possible, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Why? Because Jesus lived in obedience to the Father, every moment of every day. Jesus moved as directed by the Father, not as people desired him to. For the reason that one morning he started out and walked all day to the town of Nain, arriving as a funeral procession was underway so that he could bring hope to a desperate woman, for the same reason, on this occasion, Jesus did not get up and hurry to Bethany, because that was the Father's will. Then, after delaying 2 days, he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you're going back there?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by this world's light. It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light." Then Thomas, called in Greek Didymus, or the twin, who got a bad rap in history as a doubter, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." From these verses we can sense what the disciples thought was going on. They knew that Jesus had been in mortal danger in Jerusalem and would be again if he went back. Remember, Bethany was just a short walk from Jerusalem. When Jesus said that Lazarus' sickness would not end in death, and he didn't go to do anything about it, they must have concluded that Jesus was playing it safe. After all, why would he put himself in danger when it wasn't necessary for him to be there? After this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Lazarus is dead. after thinking he was just asleep and would simply wake up. The starkness of those words must have stunned the disciples. 2 days ago they received word that Lazarus was sick, and Jesus has been hanging around here instead of going to heal him, and now he tells them he's dead? In fact, assuming it took a day or no more than 2 days to travel to Bethany, Lazarus was already dead when Jesus received the news of his sickness. What was it about Jesus that the disciples did not yet believe? These men that have spent the past 2 years on and off in his company, who have seen his life, his miracles, his compassion and mercy. Jesus was glad he wasn't near Bethany when Lazarus fell ill, because now the disciples will believe. Believe what? Well, we need to journey on to find out. The prevailing view was then, as it is today, that death is the great divide. Like the story of Jairus' daughter last week, Jairus and his family believed that Jesus could heal the girl from sickness while she was still alive. But when she died, hope was lost. Word was sent to Jairus, "Don't bother the master anymore." In other words, it's too late. She's gone. However, Jesus had a more informed view of death. He said of Lazarus, as he said of the girl, that he was sleeping. To understand this, we need to look at Luke 16 from verse 19. Here Jesus tells the story of 2 men who died, and because he names one of them, it seems that this is an actual situation, not a parable. The person he names was, strangely, coincidentally, called Lazarus. He was a poor man, and he existed in the shadow of a rich man, hoping to survive on the cast-offs of the rich man's extravagant living. Jesus says that the poor man died, and his spirit was carried away by angels. The rich man also died and was buried, and Jesus' listeners would have had an image of him also being carried. This is a very clever piece of juxtaposition. As we discussed 2 weeks ago, the rich man would have been afforded an elaborate funeral procession, carried in an open bier, escorted by professional mourners, orators, musicians, family and acquaintances, to a burial plot just outside the city. As the story unfolds, we find that the comparative experiences of each man in death are as different as they were in life. The rich man's spirit went to Hades, where Jesus tells us he was in fire and torment, whereas the poor man's spirit was borne by the angels to a place of comfort at Abraham's side. I don't know about you, but I immediately recall another passage, Matthew chapter 22, where Jesus refutes the Sadducees who claimed that there was no resurrection. Jesus quotes his father who said, "I am the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. I am not the God of the dead, but of the living." So this place where Abraham is, where the poor man went, which is separated from Hades by an impassable chasm, is the place of the living. It seems to me then that when Jesus says that the girl is just sleeping, or Lazarus has fallen asleep, he means that their spirits have gone to the place of the living, and he is able to bring them back. They are not lost to Jesus. In verse 11, he says he is going back to Judea to wake Lazarus up. And even after he makes it plain to the disciples that Lazarus is dead, he says to them in verse 15, "Let us go to him," as if he is still alive and waiting for Jesus to visit, which, to Jesus, he was, in the place of the living. Last time we noted that Luke recorded that the little girl's spirit returned. It's my view that this is where it returned from, the place of the living. As a side note, in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, when the rich man asks for the poor man to come and minister to him in Hades, Abraham says that is not possible. But when he asks about Lazarus returning to life to warn the rich man's brothers, Abraham doesn't say that it isn't possible. Rather, he says that it is futile. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Finally, Jesus goes to Bethany. The people supporting the grieving sisters now, after several days, the ones who will encounter Jesus, are probably different from the ones who initially surrounded them. No professional mourners, few hangers-on, mainly the people who knew and loved them, but still a crowd. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." As Jesus approached Bethany, Martha, the practical one, went out to meet him outside the village. Her first words to him are a statement of fact, not a condemnation. "Lord, if circumstances had been different, if you hadn't been in danger in Jerusalem but had been ministering nearby, if our message had reached you sooner, if you'd been here, I know that Lazarus would still be alive." This is a clear statement of her faith in him, and it is followed immediately by a second. Unlike the household of Jairus, who lost all hope in the face of death, Martha says, even now there is hope. She believes that even now Jesus can return their brother to them, because the Father will give him whatever he asks for. So, Jesus, will you ask for this? Will you do this for me? For us? Will you ask the Father to restore Lazarus now and end our misery and resolve our uncertainty? Jesus could have simply said, yes. Yes, I'm going to raise Lazarus. Yes, I'm going to restore him to you. But he doesn't. He knows Martha's heart and mind. Perhaps she has a limited perception of him, a God-empowered worker of miracles. Or perhaps Jesus wants to help her see that he is not there to obey her will. Whatever it was he saw in her, he is taking her to another place in her understanding. Maybe she should have listened to him the first time, like Mary. Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" Jesus reminds her that Lazarus will rise to life at a future time. Isn't that good enough for you, Martha? There's exasperation and perhaps disappointment in her voice when she responds, "Yes, I know that. I know he's going to rise at the last day." Well, how do you think that's going to happen, Martha? I'm going to bring it about. I am the resurrection. Satan holds the keys of death and hell, but I'm going to go into Hades and take them from him. I am the resurrection. He is going to bruise my heel, but I am going to crush his head. I am the resurrection. I'm going to walk out of Hades triumphant. Death will not touch me. I am the resurrection and the life. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but shall have eternal life. Do you believe this, Martha? Yes, Lord, she told him. I believe that you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. What about you? What do you believe? Do you have ideas about Jesus, about who he is, why he came, what your rights are as his brother or sister? We must be like Martha. In our need, we must put everything aside and fall on our knees and say, "You are the Son of God, the Saviour." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Mary, the one who previously had sat listening intently to Jesus' every word, now goes out to meet him. Where Martha seems to be the extrovert, the energetic, the practical one, I have an image of Mary as the quiet, reserved one, whose eyes told of a deep love for the Master. Jesus had interacted with Martha at a practical or logical level, but with Mary it was at the emotional, the heart level. Jesus meets us as individuals. If we have a hurt, he knows how best to relieve it, but we need to be prepared to tell him what is troubling us. In the case of Martha and Mary, it was the despair of believing that if Jesus had not been off in the countryside somewhere when Lazarus became sick, their brother would still be alive. We don't know how long he was sick. We don't know how long they delayed before sending for Jesus. Perhaps they were filled with remorse for not sending sooner. Again, here is a lesson for us. Jesus has the answer. Jesus is the answer to our every need. Don't delay calling on him. Make him your companion. Talk to him hour by hour. Involve him in your thoughts, your joys, your crises, your moments of despair. Learn to lean on him as a friend who knows you better than you know yourself. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. We come now to one of the defining moments in Jesus' ministry, standing outside the tomb of Lazarus. It was defining for two reasons. By raising Lazarus from the dead, Jesus proved his sovereignty over all life. First, to those who loved him and those who were genuinely searching, this was the ultimate demonstration that he was who he said he was, the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. This was to the glory of God. But second, to those who feared Jesus, it was the ultimate demonstration of just how dangerous an enemy he was. Therefore, many of the Jews who came to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did put their faith in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. "What are we accomplishing?" they asked. "Here is this man performing many miraculous signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away our place and our nation." Then Caiaphas stood up. "You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish." He did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation. And not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life. So this incident precipitated Jesus' own death and resurrection, which was also to the glory of God. While Jesus stands outside the tomb, the cave, for a moment, put yourself inside the tomb. Imagine you are Lazarus. What has to happen before you can get off the slab of rock on which you've been laying? I think there are three main things that must be addressed. There are the specific effects of the sickness, whatever that was. There is the general decay of the body, which by now is well underway. And there is the separation of the spirit from the body. "Take away the stone," Jesus said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odour, for he's been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" A couple of times we're told that Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. The Jews believed that the spirit of a person actually remained near the body for up to 3 days. So as far as everyone is concerned, Lazarus is now absolutely and irrevocably dead. Jairus' daughter had just died. The widow of Nain's son had been dead a few hours. Perhaps there could have been lingering doubt in the minds of some, but not with Lazarus. The reality hits practical Martha when Jesus tells them to take away the stone, sealing up the cave which housed the tomb. Although earlier she had said she knew that God would give Jesus whatever he asked, now she can only think about the effects of the decay on her brother's body. But Jesus is unconcerned. And although it is not explicitly stated, it seems that Jesus is expecting that there won't be any ill effects. Instead, he is expecting to see the glory of God. So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." At what point in the account does Jesus specifically address Lazarus' needs? When does he banish the sickness and the effects of decay and call his spirit to return? I think if I was in this position, that's what I would do. But it's not recorded that Jesus does. Instead, he says, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me." You have already heard me. The communication between Jesus and the Father has already happened, perhaps days before. Jesus himself did not need any proof. The entire episode was for the benefit of those watching on, including the disciples. There should be no doubt in anyone's mind. Jesus was sent by God. But did the disciples get it? Well, it's not until sometime later, on the night before Jesus' death, that we read in John 16, Then Jesus' disciples said, "Now you are speaking clearly and without figures of speech. Now we can see that you know all things, and you do not even need to have anyone ask you questions. This makes us believe that you came from God." "You believe at last," Jesus answered. It's intriguing to me that Jesus does not specifically address Lazarus' physical situation. In fact, that is how Jesus usually operated. I've looked through all of the gospel accounts of Jesus' healing. There are 36 accounts of 20 different healings, apart from this one and excluding demon possession. In only 2 accounts is it recorded that Jesus specifically addressed the ailment. In Luke's account of the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, where Jesus rebuked the fever, and in Mark's account of the healing of the deaf man, where Jesus said to him, "Be opened." And here's something else. On many occasions, Jesus asked the recipients to do something to demonstrate their faith and realize their healing. To the paralyzed man he said, "Get up." To the man with the shriveled hand he said, "Stretch out your hand." To Jairus' daughter he said, "Get up." To the sick man at the pool of Bethesda he said, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." To the 10 lepers he said, "Go and show yourselves to the priest." To the blind man he said, "Tell me what you see." To the dead son of the widow of Nain he said, "Get up." And now Jesus stands outside the tomb of a man who has been dead for 4 days and says, "Come out." And he did. I asked you before to put yourself in Lazarus' position. Have you thought about it, what it must have been like for Lazarus? Let me suggest a scenario. In obedience to and in cooperation with Jesus the Creator, the Spirit of God had been restoring Lazarus' devastated body. When that was completed, Lazarus' own spirit returned to the earthly vessel from which 4 or 5 days earlier it had departed, and life was breathed back into him. After experiencing who knows what out of the body, in the place of the living, he suddenly finds himself in darkness, confused and disoriented. But then light begins to pour into the darkness. He realizes where he is. He's wrapped in the clothes of a dead person. Something is covering his head and his hands are bound so he can't take it off. Not knowing what to do, but before panic sets in, he hears a familiar voice. It's the Master. Jesus is standing outside, telling him to come out. So he rolls off the slab on which he lay and rolls or crawls towards the light. Again the Master's voice instructing that the clothes should be removed, followed by the shouts and screams and tears and cheers of his sisters and a great crowd of people as they see that he is perfectly whole, perfectly well, and doesn't smell at all, or at least no more than usual. In a sense, the story of Lazarus is the story of every one of us. Every one of us was dead, spiritually dead, even though we didn't know it. Every one of us has been in the tomb for 4 days. There is absolutely no hope from a human point of view. But there is a light. Jesus stands nearby and calls to us. Not a general call, but a personal call. John, come out. The question is, have you answered that call? Or are you lying on the slab, wrapped in grave clothes, ignoring his voice? It's my prayer that you will walk, run, crawl, whatever it takes, towards that light while the Master is calling.